I'm playing Final Fantasy XVI on PC right now. Look at me run around in circles. I've been playing it for the last hour or so, and that's because, well, you can too. It's available on Steam now as a demo version, and it says that the demo is the first few chapters of the game, and your save progress will carry over to the full game, which releases on September 17th. And so again, it will carry over. Now, the full game obviously costs money. It's $50 for the full game, but if you want the complete edition with all the DLC, it looks like it's $70. And we also have some system requirements, which I plan on testing out as we film this video live. Right now, I've got the 4090 in there because I want to talk about some performance issues that or at least design choices I don't like, that hopefully they can iron out in those few weeks until the game first comes out. But anyway, if you want to play the game, they're claiming 30 FPS at 720p is going to require GTX 1070, RX 5700, or an Intel Arc A580, and you want at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Also, 170 gigabytes of available space on that SSD. So that is quite a lot of space for your SSD, and just keep that in mind. Now, the demo is only about 16 gigabytes, I believe, is what I downloaded, so it's much more reasonable if you just want to check if your game can run it. And I love this trend of, like we saw Black Myth Wukong with the demo to see if your PC can run it before it comes out. Now we're getting this on Final Fantasy XVI. So I really wish more AAA games gave you the chance to demo it and see how it runs. But anyway, if you want the recommended specs for 1080p 60 FPS, and again, they're not noting the graphics settings specifically on any of these. Do keep that in mind. They are saying a 6700 XT, which is a little more powerful than the GPU in a PlayStation 5, or an RTX 2080. Also, the CPUs for 30 FPS, Ryzen 5 1600, i5 8400, they're not that powerful, but they are only saying that's for 30 FPS. They're claiming for 60 FPS, you'll need a Ryzen 7 5700X or an i7 10700. Now, in this video, I'm not set up with a whole bunch of different PCs with a whole bunch of different CPUs to test out CPU burden, but we are going to look at several graphics cards to see what we can make of it. But with that in mind, let's switch back to running on an RTX 4090. So here we are on an RTX 4090, and I've already ran through the scene a couple of times, and one thing I want you to note is that, first of all, I should probably, since I switched over to my capture card, probably make sure VSync is off so we're not capping our frame rate. Now, that does mean that you might see screen tearing, which wouldn't happen if you're playing in person on a variable refresh rate display. But you can see here that at max settings, the RTX 4090, at least in this first little actual combat mission, is hitting around 60 frames per second. But do you guys see those frame time spikes? This is on the frame time graph, and you probably saw the visual stutter. This is not my first time playing through this area. This is about my 4th time through. So those spikes are not shader compilation, and the game does have a shader compilation at the start, but there are still stutters in gameplay. Notice when I started moving again, we just had a stutter again. So sometimes and notice the frame time graph is continuing to show stutters, which is kind of obnoxious. Also, check this out. This is one of the design decisions that I'm not a fan of. Watch the frame rate hit 30 FPS now. We probably don't need to see me during the... Here, let's kill the camera. Anyway, so notice that the frame rate is now 30 frames per second. Also notice that there can still be inconsistencies in the frame pacing. So it's an inconsistent 30 frames per second in the animations, and I've noticed that sometimes when I watch this through, I get big frame time spikes on the frame time graph, and sometimes I don't. So that seems a bit inconsistent, but it's not only the first time I watch it where we can get some frame time spikes. So I don't know what quite to make of that, other than the frame rate caps of 30 FPS in cutscenes, and there's a lot of cutscenes, and they're not pre-rendered, is kind of obnoxious, and especially because the frame pacing can be improperly frame paced. Anyway, here we're into a bit of combat. Now again, the demo's short, and I've only played the first hour or so, so I can't tell you how representative this is of, more complicated areas of the game. But again, you can see that the RTX 4090 is generally above 60 frames per second. And again, we are at max settings. Now, speaking of settings, there's some good news here regarding PC technologies, which is that if we go ahead and actually go over here, we can see that right now I'm running through the DLSS pathway, and I'm using full native resolution by selecting DLAA. But also there's dynamic resolution scaling, where you can choose a frame rate target, and then the game will try to hit that frame rate target by using dynamic resolution scaling. This is more the way console games tend to work. Also, we also have FSR 3 available, and with both DLSS 3, you do have frame generation available, and you also have frame generation available with FSR 3 frame generation. However, this does not appear to be FSR 3.1, because if I switch to other upscalers like XeSS 1.3, no frame generation available. So that's a little disappointing. Again, maybe the full release would try to update to FSR 3.1, but I do kind of have my doubts on that. There's also like FSR 1 and other, more spatial upscalers available, but I would imagine most people would want to stick to FSR 3, XeSS 1.3, or if you have an RTX GPU, DLSS 3 would be the preferred method. Now again, frame generation is available, so even at full native resolution with DLAA, I can go DLSS frame generation, and now you can see that frame rates jump to around 100 frames per second from around 60. So that's good to see. But then also, and again, keep in mind, any screen tearing you're seeing is because I'm not VSync locked in a 60 FPS capture. So on a variable refresh rate display, you won't see that screen tearing. It actually does look pretty good. But anyway, we can also, without using frame generation, we can also, again, use resolution scaling. So if I go to, DLSS quality at a 4K output, again, that's another way to boost frame rates up to around 90. So that feels fairly reasonable for a major, AAA release right now at max settings. Again, you can turn settings way down. And again, you could even kick on frame generation on top of that. So with DLSS quality and frame generation enabled, we're now hitting around 150 frames per second on the RTX 4090. So my issue isn't really performance related on the high-end GPU. It's more, again, like I said, the forced 30 FPS frame rate caps when we hit cutscenes, especially because they're improperly frame paced. But anyway, what I think we should do now is probably pop in, I'm going to pop in some other graphics cards I've got going on back here, maybe the GTX 1070, something like that, maybe a few others, and go ahead and see how this performs on lower end hardware when we're kind of below max settings. And all of that. So I'm gonna pop those in and just edit the video together, so you'll see me in a second. All right, we've now fired it up on the GTX 1070. I'm at 1080p now, targeting 60 frames per second. However, I've gone down to the low graphics preset, and I did restart the game after switching just to be sure everything was good. Some games you don't need to, but we're on the FSR 3 pathway since we won't have access to DLSS here. Of course, we could try XeSS as well. And I've turned off dynamic resolution scaling. Ooh, looks like upscaling defaulted to auto. Let's go ahead and set that to native AA so I know that I'm running at full native rendering resolution. In other words, full 1080p, and then we can try scaling it from there. I have frame generation turned off for now, and you can see the rest of those settings. All right, let's go ahead and see how we're doing. So it's looking like at native 1080p, using the FSR pathway, it looks like we are not going to be able to hold even 30 FPS at low settings. So, okay. So now the system requirements did say that this would be 30 FPS at roughly 720p. Now, if you're using upscaler like FSR to hit a 720p internal resolution from a 1080p baseline, that would be the quality preset. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit FSR quality, and we can, actually see a very large boost to frame rates. So we're not hitting 60, which might be why they were saying 30, but we're actually, mid 40s right now. Again, with the caveat being that, there's definitely frame time spikes, but the caveat being that this very likely isn't the most demanding area of the game or anything. It's just like, I've played the demo for an hour or so, and this is one of the first missions where it seems like I get some actual free play kind of stuff. I will say at the low settings with upscaling, the water right now, if you look at the ground, does look quite flickery and pixelated. I do want to try switching back over to the native AA setting here and seeing if that looks a little better. Okay, yeah, it's definitely less flickery. It's still pixelated. We're on the low graphic settings, so things aren't going to be absolutely great. But yeah, so with the upscaling, it certainly turns a bit pixelated, but it does look like on the 1070 You absolutely will need to be playing below a 1080p internal resolution, even in this scene, but it does look like Quality did a pretty good job. Now, there's also the option of trying to use dynamic resolution scaling. So if I do this, it's gonna just try to hit my frame rate target that I have set. I think it's just gonna try to hit 60 frames per second and kind of scale as much as needed to do so. It's looking like it's actually going well above 60 FPS, so it might be a little more aggressive than it needs to be on this. Although when I turn the corner here, now it looks like it reacts a little bit slowly maybe, because now, yeah, it looks like it falls below 60 and then pulls back up. I wonder if actually setting a frame rate limit to 60 FPS with the frame rate limiter would actually maybe improve how that's working. So let's set a 60 FPS frame rate limit and see if this does any better job of kind of holding to that now. Okay, now kind of swinging around. Okay, we do get those dips into the 50s, and then it pulls back up pretty quick. So when I swing the camera this direction, it does pull below 60 on a quick camera pan. Let's go ahead and try this target. So we're just going low settings with a target of 60 with the dynamic scaling using FSR, kind of see how things go. Looks like the cut scene does still just hold 30 FPS. The frame pacing seems reasonable on it though. We're getting a pretty flat frame time graph. So there is that. Let me go ahead and skip through the cutscene now and get into this little bit of a combat section. So let's see if we can kind of hold 60 FPS in combat. And it's looking like, for the most part, yeah, okay, so it does still dip into the 50s, so it's not gonna be a perfect lock. So maybe that resolution scaler needs somehow to attack a little bit quicker, if that makes sense. And again, I don't know how we would be doing on a lower end CPU. We're just isolating the GPU as the variable here. So that's certainly interesting stuff. I wonder if we could maybe now, instead of dynamic scaling to target 60, I'm wondering if we actually targeted 30, if things would look significantly better. So if we go down to a 30 FPS target, I'm just curious how it goes. Looks like my camera isn't liking that. So okay, capture card didn't like this the 30 FPS capture, guys. So let's switch back to 60. But anyway, it looks like we're certainly playable. I guess we could go with the frame rate limiter set to 30 here. Although wait a minute, we have FSR3 frame generation. So let's kill the frame rate limit. Let's actually maybe go up to 120 on the frame rate limit. And I want to kick on frame generation here. So let's go with frame generation off of a, turn the dynamic resolution scaling off and use upscaling at quality. So we're at like the 720p internal rendering resolution and then using the FSR3 frame generation. Let's kind of see how that goes. So it looks like with frame generation, and the 720p internal rendering resolution, we can be up in kind of the 80s, at least in this area. The low internal rendering resolution doesn't look great. But again, we could turn off the frame generation and see how that kind of compares here. Where was that frame generation in the menu? Here we go. All right, turning off frame generation. Again, wait for the capture card to kind of adjust. So yeah, without frame generation, we were kind of in the 50s there, and then and even dipping below that. So hey, it looks like frame generation might be an interesting choice for the GTX 1070. Now, I think the last thing I want to look at for the 1070 is what if we tried out maybe higher graphics settings, maybe went with like the medium settings, but then we targeted a lower frame rate target, like 30 FPS, and then used a dynamic resolution scaling to hit it, but without frame generation. So if we want to play at 30 FPS and kind of scale as needed to lock to it, it looks like we could play at medium settings 30 FPS. I think we'd be falling below that without the dynamic scaling. We could go ahead and test that. So if I turn off the dynamic scaling, well, actually in this area, it's looking like we are holding to the 30 FPS without that. So it looks like if you want to be on higher settings, you could try them out and maybe with the dynamic scaling, but I'd like to try out some other graphics cards. So let's do that next. All right, we've now switched from the minimum GPU to the recommended GPU. This is the 6700 XT, and the game, requirements didn't say what settings to use. So it did say 1080p 60, but at what graphic settings? So currently I'm at the medium settings. It says custom because I turned off the upscaling. So we're on medium settings, but I did go ahead with the FSR3 native AA pathway and turned off dynamic resolution scaling and frame generation. So let's see how we do at 1080p medium settings native resolution on our 6700 XT. So it is looking like, we're definitely getting some frame time spikes. So that's not great. Again, there was a shader compilation step. Also, the game's not out for a few weeks. There could be driver updates. The game could get updated, things like that. So I'm hopeful for some improvements before we get into the full release. But anyway, let's go ahead and see what the cutscene looks like. Again, looks like it does cap us to 30 frames per second. Again, we just saw some spike on the frame time graph here a little bit. Let me go ahead and reset the averages for this. So you can see the 1% lows do dip below 30 at times on the frame rate here. So it's not perfect, but it does look fairly consistent here. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into the combat a little bit. So resetting the frame rate counter here for combat. And again, there are frame time spikes messing up the 1% lows, and we're getting little bits of stutters, but the average results are kind of over 60 FPS. But again, the frame pacing, not amazing. Now, this does mean that I think we could actually, at least in this scene again, maybe even kick on frame generation or some higher settings, something like that. But let's go ahead and try out frame generation. So kicking on FSR3 frame generation, which from a 60 FPS baseline is usually pretty okay. Remember, frame generation doesn't increase a game's responsiveness, and it can have image quality artifacts, but it does improve the motion fluidity, and here we're going up to around 100 frames per second, which is nice to see. Now, I do think I want to actually try out one other thing here, which is, can I get into loading here? I want to load actually back into a different area, and I want to compare whether this kind of castle environment is easier or harder on the GPUs. So let's go ahead and actually once again turn off frame generation. So getting into this menu here, so we'll get native resolution, frame generation off. So medium settings, frame gen off. This castle environment. Okay, this area does seem a lot more demanding. Interesting. So yeah, 1080p medium does not seem to lock to 60 FPS in this environment. Okay, maybe I should have tested this out on some of my other graphics cards, but hey, it is what it is. Anyway, so it's looking like, yeah, different areas of the game will certainly have different levels of demand. We can certainly be around 60 FPS, but it looks like not locked. So that's a bit unfortunate. Let's go ahead and try out testing. I guess we could try the dynamic resolution lock and let it kind of, well, or we could, frame generate off of this and kind of see where we go. It's not going to feel great on the dips, but it might smooth things out a little bit. So, hey, with frame generation enabled, I actually do think we're getting a much, when I kick on frame gen, is it also kicking on the upscaling onto auto? Because it seemed like that ran a lot smoother than it should have. No, it's left on native AA. Okay, so that does seem to be helping out quite a bit there when we kick that on. But anyway, I think that's all I've got time for this initial video. If you guys are interested enough, I could try testing out some other graphics cards and seeing how it runs. But yeah, it looks like the full game could have areas that perform at a variety of, frame rates. And it also looks like, is this running smoother now that I've been here a bit longer? No, it still dips into the 40s. Anyway, like I said, some of my biggest issues are the 30 FPS locks on the cutscenes and things like that, which is a little bit unfortunate. But Anyway, it is what it is, and you know, there's still a few weeks till the game comes out, and maybe we get some improvements and driver updates and all that, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.